Hey, good morning. This is Dr. Mike, and I wanted to share with you some thoughts on this week's work that we're engaging in. We get to the beginning of the American Revolution. This is week 4 of our studies, and we're almost at the halfway mark. So let me encourage you to put in all the effort that you can. You want to be in good shape leading into those final weeks. The American Revolution has been cast and recast in many different ways. Many great writers have attempted to tell the story, and of course, today we live in a day when they want to revise old American history and generally rewrite it for their own means. And so, I want to just kind of give you some things that I think were pertinent to this study. And we talk about the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord, beginning of the revolution. But there are a lot of things that we need to understand when it comes to the context. First of all, America, as I've said, was not ever a predominantly Christian nation in numbers. When these first settlements came, as I told you, it wasn't just the Pilgrims and the Puritans, but there were also Anglicans in Virginia, Anglicans in Charleston, and there were Huguenots that were coming, fleeing the repression of the Catholic Church in France as they had a counter Reformation and went back to being a Catholic nation. And they expelled hundreds of Huguenots that were the tradesmen of France. In fact, the terrible result of expelling all these Huguenots was that France really went into a tailspin economically, and I think that the foundation was laid with that for the French Revolution that would happen in 1789 that was catastrophic as well, that literally destroyed France down to the foundation. I mean, it destroyed the Catholic Church as an institution, destroyed the monarchy. They killed the king and the queen, and so they went back to ground zero and had to be rebuilt. In fact, Napoleon said that when he became the emperor, which was the result of there not being any leadership, he said, "I found the crown of France in the gutter, and I picked it up and put it on my own head," which he did. He actually crowned himself with the Pope sitting there rather than have the Pope crown him and give the power to give and take crowns. So that was interesting. Uh, so in America, we're already a melting pot of religions, of ethnicities. You have Muslims and you have Asians and everyone else already in the colonies from the very earliest days. And so it wasn't just a amalgam of all white Christian Americans, as we are sometimes led to believe, but America in that period from the Puritans that we talk about to the first shot go through this religious decline. In fact, their religion had really fallen off to nothing when the first Great Awakening happened, and this is a key part of what's going to lead to the Revolution. George Whitefield and John Wesley came to America mainly because the British had taken to emptying their debtors' prisons and dumping the debtors and their families in Georgia without any skills. These people did not know how to plant, they didn't know how to grow a crop. Many of the parents died, and as a result, there was a large number of orphans left in Georgia. So these two preachers came over. They were Anglican in at that point, and they had come out of Cambridge and Oxford, and they came here to start an orphanage for those children and began to preach. Wesley didn't have as big a influence as Whitefield did. Whitefield would travel up and down the coast and preach. He actually roomed with Benjamin Franklin, who was an atheist or an agnostic. There's some really great writings by Franklin about him treating Whitefield. He greatly admired Whitefield. He went to his sermons and would transcribe them and come back into Philadelphia and print them because Franklin was a printer and sold them. This is how, and Franklin literally made a small fortune transcribing and printing sermons because Whitefield had the ability to enlist and incite people to move toward God. So the Great Awakening really is the one point in American history where we probably were, as far as the invaders or the Europeans were concerned, a Christian nation. You still had to contend with millions of Native Americans who had their own religion. So that's my point of contention in saying that America was never by numbers a Christian nation is because you had this large segment of Native Americans that were not ever Christian. And of course, until they are destroyed, Native American population from the time of Columbus, which it was about 10 million, up until 1889, the end of the Indian Wars, had fallen from 10 million to 300,000. So that number declined precipitously, and they were never, and there were some Christian Native Americans, Christian Indians. In fact, some of the early Puritans actually were missionaries to the Indians, and went out and tried to win them. And there were what we call praying Indians, but they weren't ever a large population of that. So, but the Great Awakening did one particular thing, and it broke the hold, number one, of the Anglican Church. And people before that did not rebel against religion or government or whatever. And so this rebellion against the Anglican Church, and you have to understand something about that. George Whitefield and Wesley and others had to go out and preach in the city squares and in the fields because they were dissidents, and the Anglican Church did not allow them into their pulpits to preach in churches. The other point was that in the Anglican Church, most families owned their pew, and that pew had a lock and a key. And on Sundays, they would come in, open the pew, their family would sit there for the service, they'd lock it as they went out. There was no provision made for the masses. In fact, they were very much in the height of Calvinism, which believed in predestination and election. And the attitude was that if you were poor and despondent and whatever, you were not elected to heaven. And so you were pretty much just doomed for hell. So why make room? Why evangelize? Why go out and try to reach these people? And we didn't, and then didn't make places for them in their church to come, even to stand and hear the sermon. So you can understand why the masses had fallen away from religious belief. And so when Whitefield came to preach, he preached in the highways and the byways and the city squares to large crowds. Franklin actually measured the size of the crowd in Boston at 20,000, and Whitefield's voice was such that he could speak without a microphone and reach everyone in that group, and they could hear him plainly. And many people were converted, and so Christianity did have a major rise during that period, but it also broke the power of organized religion to the point people rebelled against it. And it was just a very short step from rebelling against the established religion to rebelling against your king and your country. So you have to realize that the revolution, there had to be a change of mindset from having a king that you obeyed and did what he was told to for you to stand up against the king. Remember, this is before the French Revolution. This is before the beheading of Charles I, which the Puritans would do, but they had to break that hold. And Charles I being beheaded was regicide, which was an act against God. And of course, that's going to come with the Puritans in England sometime during this period, but it's going to be a major step that moves forward. And so when we get to Lexington and Concord and the firing of the first shot, that was such a major event. This started the war between Great Britain or England and America. So that being said, the other thing I wanted to mention to you were the people that led the country during this time were not common people. They were not poor people. It was the elites in the American colonies that met to talk about the imposition of the British onto taxes and everything else. Now, let me say this in the favor of the British. There's an excellent book. I just published a review of the book called The Last King in America. Was about George III, who Queen Elizabeth, before she died, released 700,000 pages of material from George III's reign. And it presents a very different picture of what was going on in America and England than we have seen before. Our side of that was that the British king was imposing taxes, and there's several points to that you need to be aware of as you think about history. Number one, America was a British colony. You're not talking about an America being imposed upon by another foreign power. It was an American colony subject to the king, much like Great Britain was. Canada was to Great Britain. There's an interesting article in the paper yesterday about the Canadian government buying an apartment in New York for their governor general, that is their representative in the United States, to live in. And it was done in the name of the King of England. And the question was, what did King Charles have to do with the purchase of that flat? He's not going to live there and he's not going to use it, but they bought it for one of their governmental officers. The fact was it was done in his name because he is, in fact, the King of Canada as a part of the dominions under a constitutional monarchy. So you have to get the right idea and understanding that these colonials in America were British citizens and they were subject to British law and British taxation, everything else. Now, part of the problem was that they weren't paying any taxes at all. And so for a while that England was caught up in this war, which was a world war, this 30-year, 100-year war that they'd been fighting over religion ever since the 1500s with Martin Luther and the coming of the Protestants. And of course, most of Europe have fought these wars between Catholics and Protestants for years. England was in really bad shape financially, and so they didn't have the money to put armies in America, but they had to because the French, they were the last ones to fight with the French, and that war moved to America. So America had its first World War in this early day between the French and the English, and they were going to take the American colonies. And so the British government had to find a way to put troops here to keep the French from taking the American colonies on the eastern seaboard. Quite expensive. They didn't have a way to feed their armies, so they put them into the homes of these colonials, and the colonials had to feed them. And of course, they were mad about that, upset about that. But these colonials were making money. The men that sat on the council that devised the first Constitution and all these other meetings that led to the rebellion were wealthy men that were making lots of money, if nothing else, bootlegging rum and black marketing. It was a big trade. And so it's an economic issue. And they're the ones that were most hurt by it. This thing of the Stamp Act, where you had to have certain stamps on your documents. Poor people didn't mail letters to England. They didn't mail packets to England. The wealthy did. The merchants did. And so when you look at these men that sat down for the first Continental Congress or for the other Congresses before that, these were the wealthy elite men who led us into the war with England. And beside the fact they had to sell the war, every war has to be sold to the populace, to the rank and file, or nobody would go and fight. And this was where Thomas Paine's book, Common Sense, came in, and why it was so well read. Because, and number one, interestingly enough, in America, these people, even though they're branded as colonials and ignorant, were very literate. They read tremendously. And so it was a reading population. Probably 78% of Americans were literate. And so Thomas Paine's book became very, very well received. And it was about, why should we rise up against our king, who is our God-given ruler, and overthrow what is unjust about this? And so that's how the common man got involved in the American Revolution. The book I was telling you about that I reviewed tells us also that King George was bipolar, that he spent many times months at a time in bed, totally incapacitated, finally loses his mind completely at the end of his reign, and for several years is totally gone. But the lords and the people that worked under him had pretty much full reign of what was going on in America. So they're the ones. Now, there's a whole side of this history that you could study. If you want to be a history major and you want to get your master's, you can look at the American Revolution from the British side. Remember, we're very biased in that. We only talk about the American side and our perceptions of that, but you can actually study what was going on in Britain. Look at the newspapers that were being published and all of these things, and what was going on in the Parliament about America. And the fact that the English people were really up in arms against the Americans because they were being taxed to death to pay for these wars, and then to put armies in America. and the Americans weren't paying any taxes. So you can see there is some consideration on both sides of the Atlantic as to what's going on in this war. So I want you to understand that. Don't just swallow what I call the civic view of American history. That is the story Benjamin Franklin called civic history, the story we tell ourselves, about our success as nation builders, and basically how great white men won America. That's a part of that narrative that you get in high school. When you get in college, we delve a little bit deeper. We look at things from a little bit different perspective. So don't park your brains at the door, as I often tell my students, be it the schoolhouse or the church house. Investigate, ask questions. And if a place will not allow you to ask questions and get answers, then you probably need to run away from that, because that is a cult, and that is not what you need to be. You need to be able to ask questions, get your own answers. So let me encourage you to read. Reading is a great way to get perspective, and the more authors you read, every author has a different take on something, and you get a better perspective. I encourage you to read David McCullough's book 1776, which is probably the best book ever written on that year of the Revolution. That was the turning point. I study South Carolina history. I grew up there, spent 60 years there. One of the things that I enjoy reading about in South Carolina is Cornwallis and the army in South Carolina. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and his raiders delayed. South Carolina had a lot to do with our winning the Revolution, because they delayed Cornwallis to keep him from getting back to Yorktown, giving Washington time to get his army in place. And then, of course, they push Cornwallis back to the sea, and he's going to board ships and leave. And then the French show up and blockade that and cut him off. And so he had nothing to do but surrender. And so that was how we won the Revolution, which was an amazement to the world, seeing that Great Britain had so many armies and so much of a navy, that this little, bunch of ragtag colonials defeated them. But there was reasons for that, and that's why you need to answer. In fact, the Native Americans sided with the British because the British had taken Native American chiefs. I was born in Northwest Pickens County of South Carolina, right across the river. My grandfather owned the property that used to be the lower nation of the Cherokee, the Kiwi Township. They took Attakullakulla and several other chiefs from that township to England with them more than one time to show them off to the king, but also to show off England to the natives. And they were just amazed at the firepower, the ships, the army. And so they joined the British in fighting the colonials, in hoping, that if they'd side with them, they'd be treated better. As it turned out, the British lost and left the Native Americans in the hands of these crazy colonials, who then declared them in breach of treaty and took land by the thousands of acres from them, which is always going to be the case. Every treaty that was signed, there will be land given up. And finally, of course, when we get to the later in the 1800s under Andrew Jackson, they're going to be forcefully marched to the west to Oklahoma and in that area, and resettled on reservations and removed from anything east of the Mississippi. My fifth great grandmother, who I have a picture of, and have a picture of her cabin, which is preserved in a museum in Coweta, Oklahoma, was in that Trail of Tears. And so they were forcefully marched west and resettled on top of other Indians already living there. See, that's one of our problems as Europeans. We considered, and see, that was a whole story that I think I mentioned to you last time about declaring those people savages. If you declared them savages, they were not human. So it's just like cattle. You just dump people on top of people, because there were hundreds of tribes already in the West, and we act like, oh, there's nobody there, we'll just dump them over there. But you're putting people on top of people, which increases the strife and the battle even between Native Americans, making it more and more difficult for them to join forces and fight together to try to expel the Europeans and throw them out of the country. So there's a lot of things we could talk about with this. But some things are just very interesting. I'm just trying to kind of whet your appetite, encourage you to read more about this and learn the history for yourself. and you'll be the better person for that. I hope some of you are planning to teach history. I would be thrilled to know that. I do have lots of my students in other places that teach history, and history is the most interesting thing in the world as you study and see the differences of perspective. And remember that every time you pick up a book, be it history of any other kind, the first question you should ask yourself, what is this guy trying to sell me? What is his perspective on this subject? And he'll always have one. So you need to read more than one perspective to get a true picture. So, or you'll be kind of one-sided in your beliefs. We have a lot of that today, I'm sorry to say, in the Christian world, in that we're determined to make American history to be something that it was not. These founders, the men that sat on these committees that formed the Congress, go back and look at their religious backgrounds if you want to way these things are being talked about with Christian nationalism, which is, I think, is a false history. These were not evangelical Baptists or Christians. They come from all kind of backgrounds, Roman Catholic and Anglican, all these things. So they weren't trying to devise a nation of one religion. They were trying to protect all religions, as Thomas Jefferson did with his separation of church and state. He was trying to make it feasible that we don't have a state religion, but we have a place where any religious person can come and live and have a good life without being repressed. And so I hate to see that kind of going away, but we see so much of movement toward this, making us a Christian nation at the exclusion of other Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus. And we've done this all through our history. We've battled this. So it's not a new thing, but it has suddenly become a powerful thing. So I hope you'll think about that. I do invite you to respond to this video. I hope you do watch it. And when you watch it, please just let me know you watched it, whether you say anything else or not. But you feel free to engage the discussion. That's how history moves forward. We discuss and we understand and we move forward. And you find something you're interested in and read about it, study about it, and begin to build you a structure on it. And before you know it, there'll be 5 other things that tied to that. And before you know it, you'll love history like I do. History is my passion. I will be 67 years old in September. I've spent most of my life in the ministry, but that's also largely preaching and teaching history. And then since 2010, I have been doing this online for full time. So I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Have a great day, great week. And let's keep moving forward and getting our work done. Thank you so much.